Welcome all to our webinar today on the Catholic response to unaccompanied and separated children in the context of migration. My name is Ian Manzi. I'm the Program Assistant at the Collaborative on Global Children Issues at Georgetown University, and I will be your moderator today. As we keep welcoming everybody else who's joining us, as everybody keeps joining, I would like to take time and introduce to you a little bit more on the Faith and the Family Forum that has been project that's ongoing between the collaborative and Catholic Relief Services, and is within this context that we're having this webinar today. The Forum on Faith and Family Propagating and Preventing Child-Family Separation Across Time and Context is convened by Catholic Relief Services and Georgetown University's Collaborative and Global Children Issues in coordination with Changing the Way We Care initiative and strategic partners. Our webinar today on the Catholic response to unaccompanied and separated children in the context of migration is the fifth in a six-part series looking at the Catholic Church's responsibility and response to children and child-family separation across time and context. Previously, we've held discussion on the theology of the children's care and protection, caring for vulnerable children, indigenous communities, child-family separation, and the Catholic Church, as well as slavery, child-family separation, and the Catholic Church in the United States. The Christian faith began with a vulnerable child born to a displaced mother, facing a range of threats. Since then, Christian communities have interacted with children and families in precarious situations. Catholic organizations have often been on the front line offering assistance to migrants and refugees all over the world. There are now more children on the move than ever before, fleeing violence, climate disasters, and poverty, and seeking safety and protection within and across borders. Our focus today is on understanding the Catholic response to ethical, legal, and humanitarian dimensions of child migration. We'll explore personal experiences, projects, and initiatives aimed supporting unaccompanied and separated children. I have the pleasure today of having with me a number of panelists who will be sharing with us their personal experience and their work in different areas dealing with child migration. I'll have with me Dr. Hile Haka, who's from Loyola University, and she'll be joining us and discussing a little bit about her work in that field. I'll also have Batul Salum, who's an advocate for family reunification, who's going to be discussing her family history and the impact it's had on her and her work. We also have Brenda Uriza, who works with CRS in Guatemala, and she'll be telling us a little bit about the journey, the whole journey, from different perspectives of community levels. We also have Monsignor Robert Vitillo, who will be talking to us a little bit about the work that he does with his organization and the church in general in response to children within the context of migration. So to start our conversation, based in our belief that lived experience is expertise, I want us to start with Batul and her story and her experience. Given that nearly 40% of the 100 million displaced persons worldwide are under the age of 18, policy, practice, and research need to be informed by the truths and realities of children's lived experience. Batul, in what ways does your family's journey and history live on through you today? What inspired you to become an advocate for displaced individuals and family reunification? And also, why is it so important for the adults shaping the discussion around migration to take an interest in and listen to the experiences of children and young people?
Hi. Would you like me to share the story of my family's migration first?
Sure. Yeah, you can take us through the story and then tell us a little bit about how that has shaped your experience and your work and your passions today, but also why it is important for us to give time to listening to these stories and the context they're in.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I was born and raised here in Pennsylvania, but my mom and her family, she's one of 9 siblings, they all remained in Syria. My mom moved here when she got married over 20 years ago. So due to the conflict in Syria, they were forced to leave and seek refuge in another country. My grandmother, my Aunt Fatima, who's the second oldest after my mom, her husband, and their 2 daughters, as well as my youngest 2 aunts, Leen and Farah, they left Syria together and migrated to Turkey. Upon arriving there, they applied for resettlement through the UN Refugee Agency. They then had to wait for about 2 years before their application was considered. In the meantime, after 1 year in Turkey, Farah was diagnosed with angiomyosarcoma, which is a rare form of heart cancer. They spent a total of about 4 years in Turkey, with 3 of those years marked by Farah's hospitalization and cancer treatment. So not only did they struggle with the language barrier and the toll of the cancer itself, but Farah also faced discrimination as a Syrian migrant and endured ill treatment from Turkish hospital staff as a result. After 4 years in Turkey, Farah, along with my grandmother and my aunt Leen, were granted refugee status in the US, and they were able to come here ahead of Fatima and her husband in order for Farah to receive better cancer treatment in the US. When they arrived in the US, a local hospice organization had connected them with someone who could provide assistance with their resettlement. His name is Fred Rooney. A local church worked to aid them in the resettlement process as well. They stepped in, helping secure housing, covering a few months of the cost of rent, managing paperwork, driving them to doctor's appointments, and supporting them in so many different ways. Other members of the community also offered their assistance in the same things. And also the Muslim community provided them with a network of people within their faith, which was something they valued a lot, especially with the Arabic-speaking people. After a little less than a year since Farah, Leen, and my grandmother came to the US, the time to be reunited with Fatima and her family was approaching. Fatima and her husband were in the end stages of the process for resettling to the US and were told they would be traveling very soon. Unfortunately, however, the Trump administration enacted the Muslim travel ban, which stopped the resettlement in its final moments. During this time, Farah's health deteriorated, and she likely had only months left to live. So as Farah had come to terms with the reality of her health, she was devastated to hear that Fatima's resettlement had been stopped. Once in the hospital, Farah, she cried to the nurses, and she told them that she wanted to see Fatima before she dies, because of their age gap. Farah was only 2 years older than me, and Fatima was like a year younger than my mom. So Fatima basically raised her. So she was like a mother to her. So they didn't really know, my grandma and my aunts, they didn't really know what to do. So they tried contacting Fred in the hopes there was something that he could do. He requested the assistance of, at the time, Congressman Charlie Dent's staff. And at the time, then he realized that the US State Department contracts a Catholic organization, the International Catholic Migration Commission, the ICMC, to assist with all aspects of the resettlement of refugees coming to the US. And since time was of the essence because of Farah's health, he decided to reach out directly to the Vatican to see if approval of the application of our family members left behind in Turkey could be expedited. In this effort, Fred connected with the Geneva-based Monsignor Robert Vitillo, who's here today, who's the Secretary General of the ICMC, and their organization spared no effort in trying to expedite Fatima and her family's applications. While Fatima did not make it in time to be reunited with Farah, the ICMC's efforts were life-changing for my grandmother and my aunt. Fatima and her family were able to move here not long after Farah died, and this was a great comfort to my grandmother in grieving Farah's death. It was also a great comfort for Fatima, as she was also grieving the loss of Farah, along with a baby that she had and lost only 4 months after being born in Turkey while all of this was happening. So now Fatima lives here with her husband, my 2 cousins, Dana and Masa, and a younger cousin, Ahmed, who was born here after they came. And my other aunt, Leen, she got married, and now she lives in New York, and she also has 2 kids. And they're only 10 minutes away from us, my grandma. So, yeah. And I guess, so you asked, so the what the displacement feels like for a young person, and how that impacts them. So for Lean, she was fairly young when they arrived in Turkey. So what happened with her was she was deprived of her opportunity to attend college and continue her education in the long run. When she came to Turkey, she invested so much time learning Turkish. She's 100% fluent in Turkish. But then she faced another migration coming to the US, and then the challenges of adapting to English and the culture in the US, combined with Farah's health, they made pursuing higher education essentially unattainable for her. So instead, she focused on family and learning English, and she eventually got married. The displacement also affected Farah in a similar way with her education. During her time in middle school in Turkey, she wanted to finish her studies despite the challenges of the relocation. So she made efforts to learn Turkish and to enroll in schools in Turkey. This caused her a setback of, I think, a year or two. This is before she was diagnosed with cancer. But she was a very, very studious person. So despite this, she kept studying and learned Turkish and was determined to graduate and continue. So later in Turkey, when she was diagnosed with cancer, she still continued her studies, and she was able to have a teacher come to their home and help her continue at home. Then when they moved to the US here, even in her final year, she actually went to high school with me. I was a freshman in high school and she was a senior. And she ended up graduating right before she died. They held a small ceremony in my grandma's house because they knew that she wouldn't make it until the ceremony itself. But so I think it's important to take interest in and listen to the experiences of young people in general that have experience with this issue, because it's the only way we can know what things they feel most affected by, because they may not be all the same as what displaced adults feel most affected by. It's also important to listen directly to their experiences, because sometimes children and young people who experience hardships such as these understand that they have experienced hardships and how badly their lives have been affected, but they may be unaware of the different supports that could be made available to them in order to address these issues. It's also not typical in many countries that people seek out mental health support or even recognize that their mental health has reached a point where therapy or even medication is greatly warranted. I think a lot of the things others may see as debilitating trauma may seem much less concerning to a young person who's grown up hurdling traumatic experiences one after the other, so much so that it's their norm. So listening to displaced children and young people allows us to understand what mental health support could be beneficial to them, and also what things they want support for, what things they value. And then we can both offer support and explain what it is that warrants the support and why.
Thank you so much, Batul. We appreciate you sharing your family's history, and I think you sort of ended there on an important element, which is what I'm going to start with, going to Dr. Hacker and asking her as well. Understanding the vulnerability and the agency and realities of a child on the move is a critical aspect of getting to the challenges and addressing them in the context of migration. So as we dive deeper into this conversation, Dr. Hacker, can you help us sort of understand why it is important to look at migration through a child-sensitive lens, and why it is necessary to sort of add this layer of complexity to an issue that's already complex and difficult to address in so many ways? What complex interplays do we see between vulnerability and agency, and how do they inform understanding of the child's experience during migration?
Yeah, thank you so much. But thank you for sharing your family's and your story with us. I think that is actually appropriate for us to center and begin our reflections with experiences. I should perhaps also just say as a premise that I'm a so-called happy immigrant to the United States. I come from Germany and I brought 2 children with me. And I do know that even under the best circumstances and the happiest and privileged situations, children do actually struggle with their 2 identities or multiple identities, with the adaptation to a new situation and so on. My point as a Christian ethicist and Catholic ethicist is that on the one hand side, we have to see that the Christian ethics and the Catholic Church, especially, of course, has always kind of respected and looked up to children as a model for happiness, innocence, curiosity, openness. That is, and a certain carelessness that Jesus even invoked when he said that, "Look, do it as the children do. They do not care about tomorrow. They live in the present." And I believe that this model actually kind of needs to be translated into the way we look at the more kind of heavier side, as we do when we talk about migrant children or children on the move. I want to focus on your question about what does the vulnerability and the agency and relationality have to do with our discussion here. In the tradition of the church, I think that for multiple centuries, the vulnerability of children was the focus, and children were more the objects or the addressees of the church's ministry, adults' actions. And of course, this is necessary because the dependency of children on adults are apparent and evident. And that is also true when children migrate. When children, however, migrate, they do not lose this other side, the agency. So it is a real task for us, I think, that to actually find the good balance between vulnerability and agency. When I listen to your story, Batul, there are many things that come to my mind with respect to vulnerability. Over the last decades, I work a lot in medical ethics, and autonomy has become such a big dominant principle. To respect the autonomy is sometimes even identified with respecting the dignity. The Catholic Church does not do that. The Catholic Church understands dignity actually as vulnerable agency, or so I would argue at least. And the vulnerability can be kind of explained in several ways. You talked about the necessity to learn a new language, be it in the interim country, as in your case, Turkey, or then in the resettlement country. And so that is something not every child has to do, but migrant children have to do. They have to learn a new culture, a new language, and that is a vulnerability that they share among themselves, but not so much necessarily with others. There is what I call kind of a human vulnerability to illness and diseases, and this is all kind of a little bit harder to process, and perhaps harder to live through when you are a child who is dependent on the explanations of adults. You may not even understand what is going on in your body when you fall ill. You may not understand a nurse if you have access to a nurse, or the people in shelters on the way when you just get a flu, for example. Okay, and girls, when they begin to menstruate, that these are human vulnerabilities that we all share, but they are accelerated and increased when you're a minor and migrating. But there is a different kind of vulnerability that I always emphasize, and that is a moral vulnerability. As migrant children, especially those who are separated from their families on the move, know very well. They become, or they may become, targets of exploitation, targets of being seen as a burden for the adults. They may be stigmatized either before they migrate or when they resettle. So we have to look at the processes. But what I call moral vulnerability is linked to humiliation, to the feeling of not belonging, the real violence, physical or emotional violence that migrant children may face or experience. And there's certainly also a gendered moral vulnerability that we need to talk about when we are talking about assaults, for example. Yeah, but they certainly concern both genders and all people. And if you speak of the minority of transgender children, that is all kind of, increasing their moral vulnerability. And the third level, apart from the normal human vulnerability and then the moral vulnerability, I call the structural vulnerability that just concerns this group of children. And so in our theoretical work, we have tools to distinguish so that we can describe the experiences and then hopefully translate them into policies. But we must not forget, the way I started, the agency of children, especially when we talk about adolescents. And I think that is something that often, even in the responses of the Catholic Church, is perhaps not emphasized enough. And so, whereas perhaps especially Western societies highlight the agency and autonomy of people, the Church has probably highlighted so much the vulnerability that they sometimes forget the agency. And one area I want to mention here that is a thorny issue, certainly for migrant minors, is reproductive rights. Okay, and so women or mothers sometimes give their girls contraceptives and so on. And so the whole Catholic framework of sexual morality is not foreign to this area of migrant children. So my approach would be that we should actually highlight the principle of dignity that is the absolute central principle in Catholic ethics as a principle of vulnerable agency, and then elaborate on it, what it means for the migrant children. And we do have the other principles in place. It is more that we have to realize, implement them, live up to them. I want to say that I'm very, very, very proud of the work that Catholic institutions, Catholic parishes, Catholic individuals do all the time to help and support children in shelters, in, on the way, but also when they are integrated in the schools and in the communities, in the parishes. I believe that in spite of many policies where we have to really raise our voices louder, even than we do, especially in the United States, the civil or civic work is so astonishing, surprisingly wonderful, that I believe there we are really symbols of what a Christian life and a good life could mean. Maybe I leave it there for the moment.
Sure. Thank you, Hilary. I think you brought out dignity as one of the principles and sort of the social teachings and elements that are in there. And that sort of dives us into the next part of the conversation, which is really looking at the church's response and its responsibility. And the Catholic Church maintains a steadfast position on migration, grounded in its social teachings and moral values. Central to this stance is the profound respect for the inherent dignity, like Dr. Hacker just mentioned, of every individual, regardless of their migration status. Guided by the principle of solidarity, the church advocates for a compassionate and just response to migrants and refugees, emphasizing a shared humanity that unites communities. A preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable underscores the church's commitment to addressing the unique needs and rights of migrants often facing precarious circumstances, like we kept saying. And rooted in the biblical principles, the church has over time and continues to encourage the extension of hospitality and support to migrants and calls for fair migration policies at all levels, at the local, national, and international levels, with a focus on upholding human rights, family unity, and fundamental dignity for migrants. So I'm turning to you, Monsignor Fitillo. Batul mentioned her experience with the International Catholic Migration Commission, her family's experience. But as the Secretary General of the commission, how does the Catholic perspective guide the work of ICMC? And how has the church's position and its use of influence with regards to migration changed and evolved over time? As well, I think we can also add to that, in what ways does, or at least in what ways should the vulnerability of the migrating mother and child at the center of the Christ story shape and inform Catholic training and practice, and how it interacts with political realities around us?
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be with you, and it's a pleasure to see Batul again. We met 2 years ago here in Geneva when she visited here with some of her relatives, and also with others who are involved in, mostly young people who are involved in advocacy and in helping people be able to realize and achieve their human rights as migrants and refugees throughout the world. I personally was involved in the discussions around trying to get Batul's relatives to be able to get to the United States sooner. Of course, we don't hold the power of that. We facilitate the applications for refugee resettlement to the United States and also to the European Union, but it's the governments that hold that power, and we tried our best. I think we made progress, but it's good also to hear from Batul how much her grandmother was comforted by the arrival of her aunt, even though it was after her aunt died. So I think it's really important for us to remember that we're grounded in the dignity of the human person, and our church teaches, as many other faith traditions teach, that everything we do should be centered on the person. But also we should remember that that dignity is not just something that grew up inside us; it's something that was planted in us by God, and we believe that God created people in God's own image and likeness, and that's the source of the dignity, not some proclamation. We should have laws and policies understanding that and respecting it, but it doesn't come from the governments, it comes from God. And then I think it's really important also to know that the Catholic Church has been involved in this work, as the previous speaker said, from the very beginning. Sometimes people say, well, how is the Catholic Church doing things better now? Well, it's been doing that. And again, not only from theoretical teachings, but by the lived example of Jesus, and also the lived example of those in the Jewish tradition and many of the other faith traditions that showed us how to do with people, and not just for people, do with them, and how to recognize the agency, as was mentioned, as well as the vulnerability. Even you mentioned in the unmarried woman and who was pregnant, and her companion, a foster father of Jesus, and yes, they were very vulnerable. That they knocked on doors and they couldn't get anyone to let Mary in so that she could go into labor and deliver her child. But they also had the agency to gather the farm animals around this stable to be sure that the child was going to be kept warm. And they went through and they had the power to overcome the difficulties they had. And then they were gifted with the local people, the people who were simple people who could come and do homage to this child who was the savior of the world. Jesus then showed us how to care for other people, the vulnerabilities, but he also saw the potential in the people and the strength that they have. And that's what we try to do in our own organization. We were started by Pope Pius XII in 1951, a time shortly after the World War II. When Europe, but also many other parts of the world, were living with such destruction and also so much homelessness, statelessness, and people needs for being received by other countries so that they could start a new life. That Pope was criticized a lot of times that maybe he didn't say enough against Nazi Germany. But he also, what most people don't know, and what's been recognized by many of the people who lived through the Shoah, is that he also himself brought many of those refugees into Vatican City State, the smallest country of the world, and made sure that he was able to save them in that way. And then he started our organization to help find the solutions for these refugees all over the world. And he wanted it to be a global organization, not just something that we were operating in Europe. And he wanted us to connect with the church communities all over the world. We've been doing that. Some of our first work was in resettling refugees in Europe to North America, South America, Australia, and other parts of Europe that were not as affected by the war. And we've continued that. We've developed an expertise, which Batul described very well, so I don't have to repeat it. But we've been doing resettlement of refugees in the last almost 75 years. Our largest program was resettling 500,000 Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees to the United States and to Australia and to the Nordic countries. Now we're concentrating more in the Middle East, and we've been grateful to be able to serve there. We also provide emergency assistance to people, especially in complex and long-term emergencies that involve migration. And many of the things that we've done in the past are setting up safe spaces for children and for mothers in refugee and conflict situations. And there too, we see both the vulnerability as well as the agency, as well as their strengths. And we're doing a great deal now in Burkina Faso, which is a country which has huge numbers of displaced people and a lot of terrorist activity by extremists. And there we've been able to help the mothers to be able to bring their children and be educated and then help them to be able to be integrated into different areas of their own country. You asked about how the work of the church has changed with regards to migration. Again, in many ways, we've stayed true to our roots. Jesus treated the refugees and the migrants and the marginalized people. He gave us the example as well as his preaching, and so we've stayed true to that tradition. At the same time, I think we've become more organized in the kind of promotion and advocacy that we could do with refugees and migrants, so that fair and just policies could be developed. One example of that is as in 2016 to 18, as the UN was debating two global compacts, one on safe, orderly, and regular and voluntary migration, the other one a compact on refugees, and more than 190 countries of the world signed on to that. But the church and the Vatican especially, and our organizations, our Catholic-inspired organizations, work together to develop the principles that we thought that should be included in those compacts. And one great tool of that was the 20-point document of the Vatican. And many of those principles that we articulated, principles and practices, got included in those global compacts. Now the job is trying to make sure that people, the governments, implement those compacts compacts that they signed on to. It's easy to do a signing and a big ceremony. It's very different to get them to implement that. And in fact, these days, ICMC is involved in convening civil society for the Global Forum of Migration and Development. And we've worked with more than 2,000 non-governmental organizations, businesses, and municipalities to continue that kind of advocacy. And right now they're meeting here in Geneva during these days. So our staff has been very, very busy in making sure that those principles get put into practice. I think the other thing is you've asked about theological study and how we were able to prepare ministers, both those going into the priesthood, those into religious life, sisters, brothers, and also then lay ministers. How do we prepare them? Well, again, we root ourselves in the gospel, and in the gospel, Jesus showed us that love conquers all. And the early writers of the church told us that charity or love is the root of all of the virtues, including justice. So that's what we help people prepare for in their theological studies. But then they have to learn how to put it into practice. And there, I think you get that with your day-to-day interaction with people who are vulnerable in need and also who are strong and resilient. And that's a very, very important part of our pastoral practices that we promote, and that leads churches, as Batul mentioned, to being welcoming agents for refugees and migrants. The Pope says that we should have 4 pillars in our interaction with refugees and migrants, that we should, first of all, welcome them, that we should protect them, that we should promote their dignity and their agency, and then that we should integrate them. And at that point, he says that integration is a two-way street. It's not just the host doing something for the poor and dependent migrants, but it's also them receiving from those migrants and refugees the values, the hard work, the love that they bring to another country, and help to strengthen the host countries and the host regions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsignor Vitillo. And as you just said, and we'll come back to this discussion as well, the preparation and the values that we stand on, but also really looking back at growing up in East Africa and in different other places where then there's also a presence that the church has at a community level that allows it to interact with these realities at the lowest levels of communities and society. And I think, to me, that's part of something that I've experienced and I've seen and coming to Brenda, and she'll be telling us a little bit about this in terms of the perspective to practice, from going to putting a lot of these policies and a lot of these ideas and theological concepts into practice on the migration route, right? And because of geographic location, Guatemala, which is where you're based, Brenda, specifically, is one of the main migration corridors to the north. And because of its wide border with Mexico, it marks the division between the routes followed by migrants from the countries of Northern Central America and those arriving from South and Southeast Mexico trying to get to the United States. But additionally, Guatemala has another layer of complexity, which is that it exhibits a mixed movement as a country of origin, as a country of transit, and a country of return and destination in a lot of different cases. And children and family try to integrate into the countries of origin through Guatemala when they return from Mexico and the United States. So in this concept, in this space, in this reality, where these children and families share heightened vulnerability to various human rights violations along the route, including police force and abuse by police forces, and criminal groups, and exploitation, detention, and gender-based violence, physical hardship, and discrimination. I would like to ask Brenda, what role is the church playing on the migration route in Guatemala? What are we seeing on the ground? And how has the church's pastoral care for migrants evolved with the changes experienced along the route? How are we accompanying families and children along this route? And how has the church and its organization contributed to the prevention of child-family separation on the route and in the public policy arena?
Thank you, Ian. And thank you very much for having me here and being part of this very interesting conversation. I think Monsignor Vitilio just mentioned all the social teachings and the values and that are like the framework of the work of the church. And it's really important to see what's the role of the church in that trajectory, in that route of the migrants in the country. Understanding that in the past few years, even the composition or the characterization of the migrant groups have changed. For example, we've seen how in the past we will see a lot of male migrants, for example, but in recent years, we see this transformation of the caravans and the groups of people that are migrating from El Salvador, Honduras, Haiti, most recently also Venezuela, and of course, Guatemala, that are basically family units, nuclear families traveling together. And in many cases, many children unaccompanied in those groups. So it has become a crisis. We've seen how the numbers have gone, have these peaks over the years, in the past years. For example, in 2013, we saw that there were like over 1,000 children apprehended at the border between Mexico and the US. However, across time, that number has been increasing and increasing and increasing. In 2021 and 2022, over 65,000 children have been apprehended in the border. So that number really increase in a very, very fast growth. And what we've seen, those numbers are only related, especially for the ones that are apprehended, but we don't have a record actually of the number of children that are traveling. So the number should be a lot more. So in that scenario, and with this new characterization of the groups of migrants, we've seen a role of the church, a very active role in Guatemala. As you know, in the past, the Catholic Church in history has had a mandate or a very, very high engagement in the care for children. But in this past years, with the migration crisis, we've seen an active role through, for example, the Pastoral of Human Mobility in Guatemala that has a very specific plan on how to approach the problem, this issue, this crisis, providing, for example, accompaniment to the migrants through the trajectory in the country, always having in mind that migration is an option, is a right, and the decision stays with the migrant. But the church accompanies those migrants in the country. They provide humanitarian assistance, they provide shelter, they provide medicine, hygiene kits, some legal services when they are available as well, psychosocial support. And there's a whole list of interventions that the church, through the Pastoral of Human Mobility, is implementing in the country. We've seen, in the numbers I just shared, we've seen that there was a fall in 2021, of course, because COVID hits like everywhere in the country. But it's not that the migrants stopped flowing into the country, it's just that our borders were closed, were locked. So of course there was a decrease, but still people were coming in slower numbers and in lower numbers. I think the church has a very important role in advocacy for migrants. The voice of the church is really, really powerful. For example, they coordinate different networks. They participate in several influence spaces where they can bring in data. They can bring in also information about what they're doing on the ground and making sure that this problem is more visible, making sure that it's not only the job of the church. It is such a complex problem that it requires complex solutions, and it also requires the participation of several key stakeholders like the national government, the institutions that are in charge of the protection of the children, local authorities, and in our case in Guatemala, ancestral authorities as well, because many of the children that are traveling come from Mayan communities, very poor communities, and so there's a role for everyone in this solution. And us as Catholics as well, wherever we are, we can also be a voice for those children and make sure that there are social services available, psychosocial support, health, and other services. One of the things that we've seen on the ground also is a very active movement by the Jesuit network. That is, a network that includes universities, local NGOs, trying to collect data that it's also used for influence in making that information available so people are aware of what's happening. For us at CRS, I always say that I have the privilege and the blessing of working with programs that have to do with services and projects for children and youth. And that privilege has helped us, go beyond and talk to families, trying to understand how they see, this whole movement. And by talking to families, we have found, of course, trying to understand the root causes of this decision that they want to migrate, trying to understand the lack of services in the very poor local communities, and try to connect, the different key stakeholders, the decision makers, in order to, find a way to provide safe and dignified spaces for the children. One of the things that we've seen, for example, in the shelters that Pastoral of Human Mobility is running in Guatemala, is that since that characterization of the migrants have changed, they have also had to adapt to that new scenario with families and children. And in some of those shelters, they have adjusted even their facilities to make sure that the families, the family units stay together. The children are with their parents, during the time that they are in the shelter. They have also incorporated other actions like using psychosocial support tools that are even developed from other key stakeholders like UNICEF, for example. So try to make sure that everything is adjusted to respond to this increased number of children. The other thing that we have seen in the communities is the fact that when the child or the youth are deported, they come back to the country, and most of them go through this process with the government agencies, that they have to take the kids into an institution while they wait for their reunification with a family. That period of time is critical, especially for providing psychosocial support to the children, because many of them probably come back after this trial or this trip. They come back with a deep impact in their souls. Many of them have been psychologically or physically abused, malnourished, hurt, and there's a big impact in their souls, in their brain, in everything that has to do with a child. And I think it's important to take advantage of that time frame where they come back to offer that psychosocial support. What we've seen in the communities is that it's not always available. So one of the things that we're advocating for is to make sure that they are local services for the children. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but the church has done a lot of work, and we're happy to be part of this mission.
Thank you, Brenda. And I think it sort of really is important, and it's good for us to be able to see this topic of migration and children and families from these different levels. We've looked at the theoretical elements of it. We've looked at the lived experience. We've looked at the teachings of the church, and we now look at it in practice on the ground. And for all our participants who are interested in learning more about this journey and the experience of the resources that our panelists are mentioning, there will be a link that's shared in the chat box for you to be able to find more resources and learn more about this topic. And it's important for us to continue having this conversation. Now, as we move into the next section of our webinar today, I would like to welcome questions from participants as we have this dialogue. I will open this question to the panelists, all of them at once. But we would like to inform our participants that the Q&A feature is open. We are happy to receive questions and inputs from them as well to participate in this discussion. My question really goes to all of you, to Monsignor Vitillo, to Dr. Hiller-Hacker, to Brenda, to Batul as well in general. In what ways or what role do we see from lived experience, but also what we hopefully want to see in the future? In what ways can the church, or what role should the church communities play when it comes to informing and shaping policy and response to migration, especially within the context of people not necessarily being on the same page around topics like migration? There's a lot of polarization within the political arenas in multiple countries, not just in the United States. We're seeing this all over the world. People's response to migration are not necessarily positive. So I'm curious to know, how can faith and the church and church communities play a more positive role in informing and shaping policy, but also response and the way people address migration at different levels in the community? So I'd like to open it up to all our panelists. I would like to hear your thoughts a little around this. Dr. Hacker, please start us off.
Yes, and your question resonates with one of the chat questions already, you know, that there is a right to migrate, but there's also a right to actually have a structured or ordered migration policies and border policies and so on. Yeah, and that goes back to the history actually up to the 16th century, and even Immanuel Kant took it up. You know, you have a right to migrate, but there's also a right to, and a right to, or a responsibility to hospitality. But that does not mean that you have the right to stay. And this tension certainly is with us up to today. But I would start somewhere else. Refugees and asylum seekers require urgent actions. And that is a little bit different from a general migration. That is why I started with my own story. I am a safe migrant, okay, a voluntary migrant. I did not have to migrate. That is different. And there need to be structures, there need to be border policies and so on. Yeah. But when it comes to refugees who flee from crimes, from insecurity, and when it comes to asylum seekers who are fleeing political persecution, religious persecution, urgent actions are necessary. And that is why we differentiate between these two, or let's say three groups. Okay. Even though, and I think Robert can speak much better to that. Nevertheless, there need to be structures, there need to be policies. Right now, however, I can only speak for the European Union and for the United States. What we see is something else. There is a rise in xenophobia that we have not seen in decades. There are now translations of these kind of, I don't know, a resistance to acknowledge that we are all immigration countries, to policies that kind of try to keep people out, even refugees, even asylum seekers. We are not even talking about migrants. okay, or voluntary migrants. And I think that the Catholic Church needs to speak up much, much more. And one of my concerns is that as great as our work is on the civil kind of level and community levels and so on, I'm not so sure whether we are trained well enough to be public speakers, whether we do enough with respect to the implementation of the Global Compact, of the policies, whether we are critical and prophetic enough, because that is also a task of Christians, to be prophetic voices. As we have said here, we need to be the voices of the people who cannot speak, or who are not heard, who are being silenced. So I think there's a gap there, and the institutional, the public voice of the church may need to become more critical. Even kind of given the good work that we do, there is really, I believe, an urgency right now. And I acknowledge that there will always be the tension, but this tension between kind of migration rights and border policies, that can be dealt with.
Thank you, Dr. Acker. Monsignor Vitillo, speaking to what Dr. Acker is mentioning with the training and the advocacy and sort of also the reality, the political realities within which the church and its organization operate. Any thoughts on how the church and its communities can be more prophetic, can be more pronounced, as Dr. Acker is saying, in response to a lot of these challenges that they're facing on a daily basis?
Well, first of all, I think that the church is being prophetic and really doing advocacy, especially at the global level. We have to remember that I mentioned that smallest city-state in the world, Vatican City, but it's a country, and so the Vatican City-State, the Holy See, has observer status in the UN General Assembly and also in many other agencies of the UN, but it has full member status in the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and in the International Organization for Migration. So that means in those areas, it even takes a vote and is very much involved in it. But even in the other countries, I've been working as an attaché at the Holy See Mission to the UN in Geneva, and there too, we speak very frequently, and we also bring the experiences of people on the ground, and then also have side events where we invite people from countries, actual people with the lived experience, to give testimony, because we find that many of the diplomats from the countries don't even know what's happening in their own country. They hear a political point of view, but they don't know the lived experience of those who are vulnerable and those who can bring much more. So that's part of it. But I think really one of the huge gaps is that we don't, we promote, but not enough, getting to know refugees and migrants. The Holy Father says, don't only look at them for the number that they are or the problems that they have, but get to know them as people. And that's where I think the church can do a great deal, and is doing it when we get involved in church communities, resettling refugees and protecting internally displaced people who are the least protected under the various United Nations conventions, because their own country is supposed to protect them, but a lot of times their own country is the body that's harming them. So I think those are the areas that we have to help people get to know, and then they find out these people have the same challenges that we have. These people have the same talents and skills and faith that we have. And so it's not so much a we against they. I think that's an area that the church could do much more in helping bring the refugee communities and the communities in the country of origin together, and doing more together.
Thank you, Monsignor. And coming to you, Brenda, sort of building off of that as well, and the question that we've received from the audience, what short-term and long-term humanitarian assistance is being provided and can be provided, should be provided by CRS for migrants and refugees, but also taking that even further by the church and the church communities on the route, what is being done in terms of short and long-term assistance, but also what more can be done, what could be done to support, for instance, the population you mentioned, children who are being returned, who are being deported from the US or from other places and coming back to Guatemala. What can be done before the beginning of the journey, but also on the return side and supporting these communities?
Mhm. I think we have the mandate to inform families, to talk about the risk of the journey, to respond to those that are thinking about migrating. As we all said in our interventions, migration is a right. And one thing that we found important is that is within the family where those big decisions are made. And so working with families, as my colleagues mentioned, speak about it, but I would also say listen about their own stories and trying to understand their challenges, the barriers they have, and why they're making this decision to migrate. I think it's important to inform policy in the process of developing the policy. To respond to the question in the chat, CRS has been working through the support to our local partners on the ground. Many of those are our Caritas in the different areas in Guatemala. And so through our partners, we are able to access, those communities in a more broader way. And I think it's important to keep in mind that short-term could be humanitarian assistance, trying to make sure that we have, specific packages for families, delivery of food baskets, for example, hygiene kits, shelter through the support that we provide to the migrant shelters that I mentioned earlier today. And I would like to end this by saying that there's a need to design a holistic package for family strengthening. And that includes, how to work with families to be able to find opportunities in their communities if possible, find ways to also provide services for families, and design an intervention package that could strengthen the ties of the children and the families to the communities. I think that's a role that we can all do. And finally, I think in general, as Catholics, we need to do a great effort in terms of eliminating discrimination and stigmatization against migrants that go through our country. Families that come from other countries, sometimes they have to stay here also. So how can we, as Catholics, also support those families in this scenario?
Thank you, Brenda. Let's come back to you, Batul. As a young person who has chosen to dedicate your life and your career and your future to speaking out for displaced individuals, for family reunification, you've chosen a path that's not necessarily an easy one, but also not necessarily one where young people always know exactly what to do. So I'm curious to ask, what can young people do? What can either young people who've experienced this, but also anybody else as well who'd like to speak out as an ally, who'd like to stand up and support the community and engage in these discussions? What can be done from that front? How do we educate ourselves? How do you make sure that we are speaking out and making the necessary work that needs to be done in order to bring these issues to the forefront for everybody to keep mind of?
Well, I think as a young person, the best thing you can do is go, for example, like the churches or organizations near you that work with refugees or migrants. Go there and volunteer, help, and learn from them, and interact with the migrants and the refugees. I've interacted with refugees from Syria, but I think it's also important that since I'm Syrian, I also interact with refugees and migrants from other places. So just expand your knowledge from those people and from the organizations that help them, and encourage other people to do the same.
Thank you, Batul. We have questions from the
Yeah,
audience.
may I just
yes,
add
Dr.
one sentence, Ian?
Go ahead.
You know,
Yes.
I'm working at a university, and you know, the United Nations conventions on the human rights of the child sets the limit legally kind of with 18, but we always talk about youth, and that is roughly going to 25, and that is kind of the age group that I'm working with. We, as a Jesuit university, we believe in engaged learning, as we call it, and that means kind of to reach out to go to the place, go to the shelters, do internship, volunteering, and so on, go to the border. And the thing is not just to kind of emerge or immerse oneself, but actually to take the places and the spaces as sites of learning and starting points, and kind of center one's own understanding and learning on the experiences as we do, and then go from there and understand, or try to understand, what does the Convention on the Human Rights of Children actually mean? What are the responses? Are they appropriate? Are they good enough? What are the policies that we would like to see? What is the spiritual care, for example, that youths might need in the shelters, in these interim spaces? Yeah. And actually take the spaces, the process from the country of origin to the country of resettlement as one kind of axis, but also kind of the time frame from childhood to adulthood, and what do the different phases mean under these circumstances. And I believe that kind of this engaged learning model on the one hand side, but also the confrontation then with the knowledge, including the theological knowledge, of course, of the tradition. It's not that the present has it all. I mean, you know, we have to learn from history and from scripture, of course, and also from reason, as we say. These are the sources of knowledge. And I must say, I find I have the best job in the world because I can work with youths, but we have to also learn a lot how to do the learning differently. I think that Jesuit universities have started to do that. So thank you, Batul, for also kind of emphasizing that. Yeah. Mm.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hackett. We have two questions in the Q&A, and I think that these two might direct to Monsignor Patillo for a quick answer. We have a question from Jackie, who's asking what is done when kids go missing in this process, in this journey. And her question is, does the Holy See have a seat in inter-missing person in Hague? And I'm sort of coupling that up with a question from Margaret, who was asking, how are we as church and US citizens dealing with the leadership and government officials from countries where people are fleeing, in the sense of trying to address the root causes that Brenda was mentioning in a way, and asking whether there's accountability for actions and letting thousands of citizens migrate, and how the Catholic Church can use its voice in ways that addresses this issue. She's pointing out that many Catholic leaders have been powerful voices in the past about this. Leaders, clergy, and laity have been killed over some of these discussions. So what is a good way forward to use that voice in speaking out for the people who need it?
Would you like me to say something, Ian? First of all, the Catholic Church has representation in many different international organizations. And also another thing is that the Catholic Church has full diplomatic relations with 184 countries in the world. And I think we should remember that a lot gets done at the global level in these big intergovernmental structures, but a lot more also gets done on a bilateral basis between governments. And again, the Catholic Church, because of its full diplomatic relations, is able to bring some of these issues on a bilateral basis. Sometimes that kind of dialogue gets more done than at the global level. And a good example is that certainly the Catholic Church has been very much involved right now in the situation of children, Ukrainian children who have been forcibly sent to Russia, and at times they're trying to change the identity, forced adoptions, and other things. And the Catholic Church has been very active in these discussions, and also in the whole area of exchanging lists of prisoners and being able to try to promote some of the release of prisoners and others who are unjustly kept in prison. So those are some of the things that the Catholic Church does in addition to its global voices. Again, I think it's really important to emphasize that we also do it based on the rootedness in the communities, and we can bring those experiences of the communities and also introduce the voices of people from the communities at the global level. I think we're a unique entity in that, we're in those local communities. We were there before the emergencies occur, we're there while they occur, and we're also there after all of the big global agencies and even many of the big NGOs leave because there's no more funding left. I think those are the kinds of things that we could do to bring about real change.
Thank you, Monsignor. One more question, I guess, to add on to that from Philip Goldman. He's saying a strong majority of Americans welcome immigration. So in that sense, the divisions are largely in the political arena and the rhetoric there has been toxic. How has the church been engaging on the current policy debate before Congress, which may be poised to introduce significant and more restrictive changes to our immigration regime in general?
Well, hello, Philip, and thanks for the question. But I think that, again, one area that the leadership of the Catholic Church, they may debate on some issues around worship and other kinds of issues, but I think they've remained very, very strong in their advocacy around migration. And it was because of that kind of strong voice that helped us in the past when we could get politicians to speak to each other across the aisles, that help us to bring about immigration reform. The church continues to have that voice, and I think where the gap might be is that we don't talk about this enough in the local communities. We don't bring this to the pulpits enough, and I think there we might have to do a lot more in working with the local priests and ministers so that they could be able to help to change the attitudes of people who might think, I'm a good Christian, I'm a good Catholic, I do everything right, I follow all the commandments, and yet then they have a rejection of some of the people who are most vulnerable among them, including the migrants and the refugees.
Thank you, Monsignor. We also have another question that I would like to, I think this I can answer to Brenda or Dr. Hacker, any of them. Somebody's asking, could somebody address the pull factors, labor dynamics in the country of destination, and the role of remittances in irregular migration? And to that, I would sort of like to add, another question that comes in saying, do you think they're asking, do we know what are complexities? What are some of the challenges that are coming in between climate change and migration? What are we seeing on the ground, both to Bruno and Guatemala, but also Dr. Hacker, some of these complex views and layers of issues that are being introduced by the issues of climate change and the urgency that you mentioned earlier?
For me, these are, of course, two huge questions. Yeah, the push-pull factor. Again, I would urge us to kind of distinguish between the different groups of people who are on the move. And this also concerns children, but for the last decade or so, the climate change certainly has become a major factor, and this will not stop. There are a lot of reports and really good reports also from the United Nations and from the Vatican highlighting especially the humanitarian crisis that will only become bigger with respect to climate change, and so that is probably more a push factor. But the pull factor concerns something that we also rarely address, which is, I'm an ethicist, major part of my work, and that is the global injustice, the global economic injustice. And we are in a situation of a lot of changes right now, but what we have seen over the last decades is really kind of, instead of fighting poverty, there has been a lot of progress in different countries, but overall, if you look at the global economic injustice, we have seen that the gap between the richest few people and the rest of the world has become even larger, even though the Millennium Goals and now the sustainability goals and development goals, they have been really successful programs, and I don't want to underestimate that. But the kind of the wealth in the hand of a few people is a big concern. So the global injustice structure, of course, creates a push factor, and the pull factor becomes an issue then too, because where are the opportunities for people to go to, and to, as Brenda and others have said, there is a right to migration, and we have to deal with that. And just to close the borders and pretend that we are not part of the world and that there is not a history that we have to, of injustice that we have to deal with, does not help. And so from there, from the bird's view to the policies and then to the local level, there are multiple steps that are needed. But I mean, there are a lot of agencies and there are a lot of experts who are doing that. And sometimes it is really a question of the bigger narrative. I believe that the two big institutions, the United Nations leadership and the Vatican Pope and Robert and the refugee agencies, they're trying to create a different narrative to kind of like let us kind of close the borders policies. Yeah, and I believe that this is the only moral narrative that we have, and we have to work on that. Yeah, so it is impossible for me to really go into the nitty-gritty stuff of the policies that try to deal with the push-pull factors here. But I want to say one more thing. Maybe it is because I'm from Germany and I live in the United States. I'm really concerned because in my home country, Germany, we have the history of kind of all of a sudden in the 1930s and then the 1940s of the Holocaust, but that started with voluntary remigration and then deportation and then extermination and killing of 6 million Jews. And the Catholic Church did not speak out in the beginning, did not. And I am very concerned that there is a policy narrative right now that speaks of deportation, remigration. In Germany over the last weekend, there were almost 1 million people in the streets protesting the right-wing turn in our country. And I believe that is what we need to see much more. A kind of a resistance, a protest against a mindset that I believe is unchristian and has nothing whatsoever to do with a culture of hospitality, of welcoming, and a culture that takes seriously the dignity of every individual. And then we can talk about policies and fairness and justice. But solidarity, accompaniment when it is urgent, that comes first for a Christian. And I believe that we are in a situation right now, at least in Europe and in the United States, where Christians have to do some soul searching here. What is the core of our mission?
Thank you, Dr. Hacker. And as we go to you, Brenda, and as you speak a little bit more from the ground and some of these factors that we're looking at, there was also a question that was asked around some migrating and displaced children ending up on the streets because of conditions and situations in either in countries of transit or in countries of destination or where they're moving to begin with. So with they asked a question of saying, how has CRS and other agencies and organizations tried to engage and mainstream these children, this group of children who may be experiencing homelessness or being on the streets and being in these situations, how you're able to address some of these challenges that children on the move are facing in transit and on the migration route in general.
So for the first topic about the remittances and the pull factors, I think one of the things that we've seen on the ground is that there's what they call the mirror factor, like, okay, I see my neighbor, I'm living in a very, very poor condition, but I see my neighbor who's building a bigger house because the father and the aunt or whoever in the family is gone through the US and is sending now money for the family. So when you see that in the community, of course, many people say, I want that, and I want to have my own house like they do. But they don't talk about everything that happened in between, from the time they leave to the time where they are actually able to send something to the communities. And I think that's a thing that we need to continue promoting that conversation, because there are a lot of risks in the trip itself. For everybody. But for this forum today that we're talking about children, I think one thing I didn't mention before is that some of the children that are traveling because they want to be reunified with their parents that are already there, right? And so it's not only sending an accompany, but it's that dream of, okay, I want to be reunited with my family. And they try several times. And then there's a factor also that when adolescents come back, for example, without being successful, they come with that burden that the family has acquired the debt to pay for that trip. And so they feel ashamed. There's a factor there where they feel ashamed. They're now in debt, and very soon as they have the opportunity, they will migrate again. So it goes like the poverty cycle going again. So that was one thing I wanted to say. And then the one that they address about children staying in the streets. We see a lot of that in the border with Mexico, in the southern border of Mexico and Guatemala, where there's a community in Tapachula, for example, where a lot of migrants are stuck there waiting for a process, the process of their papers to continue, their path through Mexico. And so I think children are more vulnerable even in that scenario, because they could be, trafficked, they could be, I don't want to name all the problems because we don't have the time, but it's a big factor there. So how do we engage in that? Again, as I mentioned before, we're working with our local partners in the country and in those areas, especially also to be able to respond somehow to that need. But it's a huge problem. I mean, I don't think it's just a role for one organization. I think we need to work together with other agencies to respond to this migration crisis.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you all for a wonderful conversation. As we close and as we finished up, I'd like to use this final question to sort of share some of our reflection, all of us. One of the participants pointed out that in this polarized and difficult environment, a lot of people, a lot of church communities, a lot of groups and communities in general have chosen not to engage with difficult conversation. You've chosen not to be involved in a lot of this dialogue around issues like migration that are very difficult to digest. So one of the questions we've been asked is, how do we start these conversations in our communities, with our church leadership, with our pastoral teams? How do we build within our communities platforms and opportunities for conversations like this sort of engagement to happen, despite the fact that everybody's afraid to say the wrong thing or to be labeled in a certain way or seen one or the other? I'll start with you, Batul. How do you start conversations like this in your community as we close? How can we reflect on this question in general?
Well, I think for one thing, just bringing people, like for example, in the mosques, bringing speakers who work in these areas, who were refugees themselves, to come and give a talk and invite people to come and eat, and then people hear about this, and then they get more interested, so you keep inviting more speakers. When I came back from when we went to Geneva to visit the ICMC and learn from them a little bit, some of the people that went there, we did a panel in the mosque, and that got a lot of people interested in doing refugee advocacy on behalf, like with the mosque, on behalf of the mosque. So I think just bringing people to the different organizations, to the areas, to the places where they don't really want, or they're not really interested, there's not much interest in doing that sort of thing, then I think it will create interest.
Thank you, Batul. Monsignor Wetilo.
Well, I think Batul gave the answer that I would have given as well. As I said, Pope Francis is constantly saying, get to know the migrants and refugees, see them as persons, not as a problem. And I think, that's in many cases in local parishes and other churches and mosques as well. It's a social gathering, not only a religious gathering. And that's where you take the opportunity. You have a potluck dinner. You have the refugees and the migrants bringing their food, and you have your food. And I think that's the way you really get to know people. The other thing is engaging people to help welcome the people. I've been very active in Ukraine these days for the last 2 years now, and it's really very, very important for the local churches to serve the internally displaced people, just as the churches and other groups are serving those who cross the border into the neighboring countries around Ukraine, and even to the United States. So we were just active, our organization, in helping 2 Ukrainian families that wanted to come for the protected status in the United States. And we processed all of that for them. But we also then made sure that there were both Catholic Charities and the local parishes, one an Episcopalian parish, another one a Catholic parish, that received these families, and that will help to shape more positive perspectives on the situation in Ukraine and on trying to find the ways to promote peace.
Thank you, Monsignor.
And I would just like to add that it is just a reality and a fact that we all know that there are different wings, different voices, polarization within the church too. How could it not be? Because there is this polarization in our societies. And I believe that sometimes it might already help to sit down and read some of the parables and try to connect the stories that are told there of the people who are silenced, the people who are marginalized, and then brought to the center, and connect them to the stories. If you do not have the opportunity to get speakers, see faces, hear the stories of the people who have come, maybe it gives you the opportunity then to actually begin little groups, circles. Yeah, we see that the parishes have become also places that given the structure of the church, they are not as vibrant as they should be, but there are so many groups and so many opportunities. And sometimes maybe we have to remember that there were house churches too, that one can gather together and say, okay, we will start to talk about it, and then maybe invite people. And I think in every city there are initiatives, there are organizations, there is the Catholic Church, and one can get in touch with them. And if a pastor or a bishop is not willing to have these conversations about a humanitarian crisis, then maybe it needs to start bottom up. That is my answer. And I believe the sources we have the Bible, if nothing else.
Thank you, Ella. Brenda, closing us off with final thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think that as Catholics, we're all called to care for children. And I think we can start this as our own mission, talking within our families, in our work, in our circles in general, raising awareness about the importance of this issue, and discuss with other people, get to know, as Monsignor Vitilio said, get to know the migrants and understand their needs, so we can have a better informed way to support them in the process.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for your thoughts, for sharing your experiences and your stories. Thank you to the participants, the audience, and everybody who was with us today. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and we hope to see you as we go to our final webinar soon. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening to all.